It's Friday, the 9th of February. My name's Juan Brown. You're watching the Blanco Lirio channel. Fresh back from another Sydney run. Just landed this morning about 6 a.m., so bear with a little jet lag here, but we've got to go over the NTSB preliminary report on Alaska Airlines Flight 1282. Let's check it out. And here is the picture we were all waiting for. The picture of the upper track guide fittings where the bolts were supposed to have been that held this door in place. When investigators picked this door plug up from that front yard in Portland, Oregon, and they looked in that hole, they knew right away what the deal was. There was never any bolts securing this door in place. So that's what got the ball rolling so quickly to ground the fleet, start the emergency airworthiness directive, and it got the CEO from Boeing right out on the carpet right away. But it took the NTSB, well, it's been nearly a month now, to share all this information with the rest of us. Here's another view of the guide fitting. Side view. This blue rectangle here is representative of where the bolt should go. And if we had a picture of this without the blue rectangle, you can see just how pristine the paint still is on the inside of these holes, which indicate that there never was any bolts in this door the whole time that it was operational. And here's a portion of the guide fitting that was ripped out during the depressurization. This did not cause the depressurization. This was a result of the door leaving the aircraft and ripping this tab off from the guide fitting. Let's do a quick review of how this door works, again courtesy of the New York Times animation. I've got it slowed down this time. The 4 bolts need to be removed and the door lifted 1.5 inches in order for the door to clear the stops to be either opened or removed. So here's the 2 lower hinges, it's shown in yellow here. Here's the 2 upper guide fittings shown in blue above. Here's the hinges. They clear, the 2 stop fittings clear each other. The spring gets compressed, and then the bolt is supposed to be threaded into that fitting. And it was this fitting that ripped off of this aircraft. This particular forward fitting is missing completely from the aircraft. Those 4 bolts severed. And here's how the guide fitting works. And it drops right down into place. And you put in the AN6 bolt, castellated nut, and cotter pin to secure it. And that's one of the 4 bolts that was missing. Remember, from this photo of 4 Alpha Lima, not long after the incident, we could see the 2 hinges right here, and we can see this hinge guide fitting, the aftmost one, still attached to the hinge itself. So the spring in the aft fitting is still on the aft hinge. Now here's that same lower aft hinge fitting in the report here, and once again, those holes are just pristine. That's still the primer from the original construction. So apparently both of these the hinge guide fittings were ripped off of the door from these 4 bolts right here. This one just happened to stay in the hinge. The other one is still missing. And in the process of departing the aircraft, the fracture of this fitting off of the door also bent the hinge itself. Now, when I say the bolts were never in place, they were in place initially when the aircraft was initially built, but the bolts were never in place apparently during the entire operational period of this aircraft once it left the Boeing factory. So in this report, Boeing gives a pretty clear timeline of how this works. The door plug itself is built in Malaysia. It's shipped to Spirit in Wichita. Spirit in Wichita QCs it and then installs it in the aircraft and bolts it into the aircraft and then ships the fuselage to Boeing. It's there at Boeing that the problem arises. Once the aircraft leaves Boeing, it is shipped over to Oklahoma City to get the Wi-Fi installed, but there is no reports of these plug doors being opened at all at Wichita during the Wi-Fi installation, and there's no indication that these plug doors were ever opened once they left the Boeing factory. So the problem occurred at Boeing when they had to repair some rivets behind this door. So what were they working on at Boeing that required the opening of this left door plug? It was these rivets located way back here in the corner. These are two separate pictures we're looking at. Here's the door of the accident aircraft itself, and the rivets are marked apparently with tape here, and they're located way back here behind this bulkhead. And in the picture on the right, you can just barely make out those rivets. And I'm not sure, but I think those rivets are associated with or underneath the door seal. So in order to access these rivets, to rework them, again, because of this is a quality issue coming out of Spirit Aerospace. Remember watching the previous updates how there was so many quality escapes out of Spirit Aerospace that they had to send Spirit people up to Boeing to continue to fix their problems as they were flagged as they went through the Boeing assembly line. So the Spirit workers had to get in here to rework these rivets. Remember, a rivet's got to be squashed down just exactly right based on the diameter and length of the rivet and the size of material that it's fastening together. And if it doesn't make those specifications, it's out of there. Or if the tail's bucked all wrong, or there's any number of ways you can reject a rivet. So they got to get in here to fix these rivets. And the only way they're going to be able to do this is to open this door plug. Here's another picture of the actual door that failed on Alaska 1282. And here's a picture of the seal that they're holding in his hand here I believe in order to gain access to these rivets that he's got to rework. So here's a picture of the door plug in the open position. And here's the damning evidence provided by Boeing of the actual door plug in place with no bolts in the proper location to retain this door. And at this point, somewhere along the assembly line, there was no call out in the paperwork to go back and inspect this door to make sure that these bolts were in. And that's going to be the embarrassing allegations and the embarrassing facts that are going to come out of this investigation. More on that in a minute. So remember, this door plug uses 12 stop fittings mounted on the door, which line up with 12 stop pads, which is mounted to the frame of the door, or the fuselage, to plug the door in place once it's properly set into place. So after the door blew out and they recovered it, they brought it back to the lab, and they also unbolted the stop pads, the 12 stop pads, off of the fuselage so that they could compare the notes of how the door scraped over these pads. And here's what they found, how the damage occurred, or what damage occurred when the door left the aircraft. When I first looked at this picture, I thought, wait a minute, what are these bolts doing all loose? Well, duh, they've taken it off of the aircraft, and they're just showing it to you to show you this damage between the two parts here. So the stop pin, this pin threads in here to tighten up the fitting between the door just to keep it from rattling around. It doesn't bolt the door or anything like that. It just makes a good contact with this stop pad fitting. And here on this stop pad fitting, this kind of polished surface, you can see the stop pin chattering vertically on its way out of the aircraft. So the frightening part was this chattering, vertical chattering, was that over a long period of time? And was this door just hanging by a thread up here for the longest time before it finally failed? Or did this all come apart all at once? But regardless, once it came apart, it ripped across the stop fitting, and the stop pad ripped across each other pretty good and caused quite a bit of damage right there. And it was a closer look at this damage to this aircraft that gave investigators quite a bit of a startle as to just how close of a disaster this potentially was. The fact that nobody was sitting in these two seats, they're still claiming it to be a bit of a miracle. We don't know why. I'm not convinced that we've heard the final answer as to why two people were not sitting in those seats. But the damage to these seats, remember there was a young man sitting, I believe, in this seat right here who lost his shirt and his socks and his cell phone. Nobody was in this seat, and this seat is bent forward and out towards leaving the aircraft. And of course, all the cushions got sucked out as well, so they're missing. And this seat got twisted back and towards the open door. So that was a tremendous amount of explosive force outward when this door popped open at just 16,000 feet. Here in the report, they describe the door plug dimensions as 29 inches wide and 59 inches high. So that's 1,711 square inches. Climbing through 16,000 feet with the altitude of the aircraft at 16,000 feet, with the cabin altitude climbing slowly, the pressure differential at the time that this door blew out was about 5.7 pounds per square inch. So 5.7 pounds per square inch times the area of the door, 1,711 square inches, that's 9,752 pounds of force on that door, popping it out away from the airplane. Now, the big concern is, and this was mentioned by a lot of you in the comment section and by the investigators themselves, what if this had happened at altitude? Well, my first thought was that at altitude, the pressure differential is usually upwards of 8 pounds per square inch. I would think that that would have held the door in place against those door plug stops. Right here, the force would have been so great that my initial thought was the door would not have been able to move at all up at altitude. But if this door was hanging by a thread, like this picture shows here, man, that would have been a disaster. That would have been 13,600 plus pounds of force shoving that door out of there. Now, if we look at the structure of this aircraft, like any aircraft, it's built with bulkheads and stringers. Let me go like that. Stringers, right? And so if you remove that bulkhead from those stringers, is the door frame strong enough to prevent those stringers from just blowing all the way out? In other words, if this had happened at altitude, would this whole structure would have survived, or would those stringers begin to blow out and then the entire fuselage starts to open up and you lose the entire airplane? Would be disintegrating somewhere over southern Oregon or northern California, until they had found the door, it would have taken so much longer to figure out what happened to that aircraft. And of course, everybody would have been lost as a result of that disaster. That this came so close to being such a major, that would have been the third major disaster for Boeing, of a complete and total hull loss for the want of 4 AN6 bolts. Now we have more details on the aircrew actions. The captain was both experienced aircrew members. The captain, 12,700 hours total time, 6,500 in the 737. FO, 8,300 hours total time, 1,500 hours in the 737. The captain was the pilot flying, and the FO was the pilot monitoring. That means that the FO, the pilot monitoring in this case, would be the pilot doing the radio calls. The flight crew stated that the pre-flight, engine start, taxi, takeoff, and departure climb were unremarkable. After takeoff, they were cleared to flight level 230. The captain said that while climbing through about 16,000 feet, there was a loud bang, obviously. Unfortunately, we don't have the cockpit voice recorders because that data got overwritten because nobody pulled the circuit breakers to the cockpit voice recorders. But of course, they got the data recorders. The captain said that while climbing through about 16,000 feet, there was a loud bang. The flight crew said their ears popped, and the captain said his head was pushed into the heads-up display, and his headset was pushed up, nearly falling off of his head. So in the 737, instead of having Cat 3 Autoland, in order to keep things a little less expensive, they give you a heads-up display, and then the captain manually flies the aircraft using the heads-up display, and it's mounted in above him and ahead of him. So it's when they have this depressurization, the initial thrust is forward instead of back. It kind of reminds me of that old science experiment of if you have a van closed up and you put a helium balloon in the middle of the van, and then you, from a standing start, you accelerate the van, which way is the helium balloon going to move? And you think it's just going to move back in reaction to the acceleration. But no, the air moves to the back of the van and pushes the helium balloon forward. I don't know if that's the same science that's going on here, but initially they got a big bang and a push forward. The FO said her headset was completely removed due to the rapid outflow of air from the flight deck. Both flight crews said that they immediately donned their oxygen masks, and they added that the flight deck door was blown open, then it was very noisy and difficult to communicate. The flight crew immediately contacted ATC, declared the emergency, requested lower altitude. They got and received 10,000 feet, and the captain said then requested the rapid decompression checklist, and the FO executed the required checklist from the QRC, the Quick Reference Handbook. As the FO completed the checklist, the captain flew the airplane as they coordinated with ATC to return to the Portland airport, and the flight landed on runway 28 left without further incident and taxied to the gate. And look at this initial timeline. Just an incredible job by this crew. So they take off at 6 after 5. Just 6 minutes later, remember these Maxes climb pretty good with these new engines. 6 minutes later, they're climbing through 16,000 feet, and that's when they begin to get the warnings, and then the pressure drop. About 1 second later, it's down to 0 psi. Less than 20 seconds later, the master caution is deactivated. So within 20 seconds, the crew has got their stuff together and got their headsets and their communications beginning to get reestablished, and they can reach up there and turn off the master caution warning. Just 67 seconds after the initial bang, they peak out of their climb. Again, that thing's climbing at a high rate of climb, and they top out at 16,320 feet. And less than a minute and a half after the initial bang, the altitude select window is selected down to 10,000 feet. So they got the coordination for the lower altitude, and they got the aircraft heading down to 10,000 feet within less than a minute and a half. And they're back on the ground at 5:26, just some 20 minutes after takeoff. So just a quick, great job by the crew, just falling back on their training. And remember, when I'm talking about the basic aircraft structure of bulkheads and stringers, it's these stringers in the door here that line up with the stop pins, and these stringers in the frame that translate that load right through the door plug. And when that's gone, at altitude, would this frame be able to hold that? I don't know. I don't think so. So I want to thank all the parties involved for their openness and sharing all this information with the NTSB. I don't know if they had any choice, but this is a pretty damning picture from Boeing showing the actual accident door in place without the bolts in place. Kind of an interesting looking bit of graffiti here on the window. Or is that to remind somebody that, hey, you got to inspect this before it moves on down the line? I think the embarrassing allegations, if what we're reading on the message boards is true, is that there is virtually no difference in the Boeing quality control mechanism between a door plug and a plug door. If it's a door, a regular operational door, you open and close that door every day. It doesn't need to be inspected, right? But if you remove that door, then you got to completely re-rig the door and inspect it. A door plug, however, in order to open a door plug, you have to remove the bolts. So in order to close the door plug, you need to inspect it and make sure the 4 bolts are back in place. So it may very well come down to a semantics problem with the paperwork and the way that Boeing reads the quality control and does not distinguish the difference between a door plug and a plug door. As we get more information, we'll keep you posted here. Thank you so much for your support, especially the folks over on Patreon that make this content possible. I'll whip this together real quick and go have some rest. See you here.